If there's one thing I've learned from spending years behind a fake news desk telling real jokes about fake headlines that somehow become real headlines 3 days later, it's this: Washington never actually sleeps. It just changes bars. People think the nation's capital is all marble monuments, motorcades, and important people carrying folders they never open. That's adorable. The real city comes alive after midnight. That's when the speeches disappear. Ties get loosened, the carefully rehearsed talking points dissolve into whiskey, and somehow everyone starts believing they're the funniest person in the room. I didn't mean to find myself there. Honestly, I was just looking for somewhere quiet after another long week of pretending to explain the news while secretly hoping someone else understood it first. The bartender looked at me the moment I walked in. "You look exhausted. I host comedy for a living." He nodded sympathetically. "Double? I didn't even order yet. You have that face." Fair enough, the place didn't have a name outside. Just a faded neon sign shaped like a cocktail glass that flickered every few seconds as if it also needed caffeine.
Inside, though?
It felt less like a neighborhood bar and more like a witness protection program for people whose names accidentally appear in newspapers every morning. The lights were dim enough that everyone looked 10 years younger. Or 10 years guiltier. The jukebox was playing classic rock loud enough to drown out conversations, which was probably intentional. Nobody wanted to hear anyone else's secrets. At least, that was the theory. The bartender slid a drink toward me. "On the house? Why?" "You look like you're about to watch something. I wasn't planning on it." He smiled. "Nobody ever is." That should have been my warning. The front door swung open hard enough to rattle every bottle behind the bar. A man marched inside with the confidence of someone who'd never once considered using an indoor voice. He slapped both hands on the counter. My usual. The bartender didn't even ask what that meant. Apparently everyone had a usual here: glass.
A drink that looked strong enough to remove paint. The guy raised it proudly.
To another successful day. No one asked what had been successful. No one wanted clarification. Washington has a fascinating relationship with follow-up questions. You'd think people whose entire careers revolve around investigations would ask more of them. Instead, everyone simply nodded as though that sentence could mean absolutely anything, which, in fairness, it probably did. I watched him look around the room with complete satisfaction. "This place," he sighed, "is the only spot where I can relax." The bartender laughed. "Because nobody from work comes here?" "Exactly." There was a dramatic pause, then the door exploded open again. Wrong. Every head turned. The familiar political heavyweight strolled inside like he'd just won a popularity contest. Nobody remembered entering. He pointed dramatically across the room. "There you are."
The first guy groaned. "Oh, no. Oh, yes."
Newcomer climbed onto the stool beside him without being invited. "Imagine running into you here. I literally came here so I wouldn't. Life is full of surprises. So are congressional hearings." The bartender sighed before either man spoke another word. "I already know." Without waiting for an order, he reached for the expensive shelf. "You two again? We're regulars. I know. You should appreciate loyal customers. Appreciate boring customers." The first man lifted his glass. "You know what's funny? Probably not. We both had enormous weeks." His friend nodded enthusiastically.
"The biggest you ever look around and think..."
He leaned closer. "How did we end up in charge of anything?" The second man burst into laughter. "Oh, constantly. I mean," the first man gestured broadly. "Look at us. We're in a basement bar arguing about whose week was crazier," the bartender interrupted. "That's not even in tonight's top 5 conversations. What beat us? Someone spent 20 minutes trying to convince another customer the Constitution should come with software updates. Did it? They're still debating." I couldn't help smiling. This place was unbelievable. Perhaps perfectly believable, which was somehow worse. One politician leaned back dramatically. "I've barely slept. Busy?"
No. He looked into his drink thoughtfully. "I just keep refreshing the news."
"For your name?" "No." See, he took another sip. "Terrified, I'll find it." Everyone laughed, including me, because that's actually a pretty relatable fear if you work in television or politics or middle school. The round arrived. Nobody remembered ordering it. The bartender shrugged. I know the rhythm. There was something strangely fascinating about watching powerful people act exactly like college roommates who'd accidentally grown older without becoming wiser. Their conversations jumped between enormous global issues and unbelievably petty complaints. I've had 12 meetings today. I had 13. I skipped 4. I forgot mine existed. I congratulated someone for a bill they voted against. I congratulated myself. You probably deserved it. Honestly? Maybe. The bartender polished another glass. I've heard kindergarten classrooms with more emotional maturity. One of the politicians looked offended. That's insulting to kindergartners. Another eruption of laughter. The jukebox switched songs. Someone in the back started singing along loudly despite knowing maybe 4 words. Nobody complained. In fact, 2 strangers joined him with complete confidence and completely different lyrics. That's another thing I've noticed about bars. Confidence has absolutely nothing to do with accuracy. A woman near the corner raised her glass to surviving another news cycle. Everyone toasted. Even people who clearly had no idea what they were celebrating. The first politician leaned toward me. You work in comedy. Guilty. Tell me honestly. That's dangerous. Are people laughing with us or at us? I stared into my drink for a second. Does it matter? He considered that. No. Then congratulations. He pointed approvingly. That's why comedians are dangerous. We're mostly just tired. The bartender interrupted again. Oh, what? You're observant. That's much worse. The room suddenly erupted as another recognizable face wandered through the door. Apparently, this bar operated like a political convention nobody admitted attending. The newcomer wore the relaxed expression of someone who believed every room automatically became his room. He greeted people by first name. Half the room answered. The other half quietly checked where their wallets were. Into a chair.
Who's winning?
We're not competing. Everyone in Washington is competing. Fair point. Another drink appeared instantly. You already poured it? I saw your car. You know my car? And thickets.
I know your parking tickets. More laughters. Someone ordered appetizers. Nobody touched them.
That's another Washington tradition. People only eat after they know whether they're staying employed. The conversations became louder. The stories became stranger. Every person seemed convinced they had experienced the most unbelievable week imaginable. I had 6 interviews. I accidentally gave 3. I attended the wrong meeting. I chaired the wrong meeting. I argued with myself online.
You won?
Absolutely. The bartender finally leaned across the counter.
I've got a serious question.
Everyone looked over. When was the last time any of you had a normal day? Silence. One man counted silently on his fingers. Another stared thoughtfully into his glass. Finally, someone answered. I think long pause. 2014, the room exploded. Even the bartender laughed. I thought so. I looked around. There was something strangely comforting about watching people who constantly appeared larger than life reveal themselves to be exactly what everyone else becomes after midnight. Tired, overconfitted, deprived. Since tomorrow would somehow be less chaotic despite every shred of evidence suggesting otherwise. Outside, Washington remained polished and powerful. Inside this little basement bar, it looked remarkably human, messy, ridiculous, occasionally self-aware, and fueled almost entirely by caffeine during the day and bourbon at night. I had the distinct feeling the evening was only getting started. Because every time I thought the room had reached peak absurdity, the front door opened again. The front door opened again, not dramatically this time. No crashing entrance, no heroic pose. Just a slow creak, followed by someone poking their head inside as if they were checking whether this was still the safest place in Washington to accidentally tell the truth. The bartender looked up.
You lost? No. You followed somebody? Maybe.
You work in government? The newcomer hesitated. How'd you know? The bartender pointed toward the hesitation. Dead giveaway. Laughter rolled through the room. I was beginning to understand this place. Nobody introduced themselves. Nobody asked what anybody did. Everyone simply assumed everyone else had spent the day making decisions they now preferred not to discuss until at least their second drink. The newcomer slid onto an empty stool. "What'll it be?" the bartender asked. "Something that doesn't remind me of today. So water?" The entire bar laughed, even the newcomer. "Okay," he admitted. "Make it something stronger than water. Now you're speaking Washington." I glanced around the room. An hour earlier, everyone had looked like strangers. They looked like old college roommates at a reunion where nobody could remember who still owed money from spring break. People who had spent all day arguing on television were suddenly debating whether onion rings counted as vegetables. Someone insisted they absolutely did. Someone else claimed ketchup made fries healthy. The bartender refused to participate. "I've heard enough misinformation today." The television mounted above the bar silently played cable news. Nobody bothered turning on the sound. Apparently, after spending an entire day inside politics, silence was considered premium entertainment. Every few minutes, someone glanced up, saw their own face on television, then immediately looked away. One guy sighed. "I swear I look more tired on TV." Another answered, "You look more tired in person." "Thanks. You're welcome." I couldn't resist asking the bartender, "So, does this happen every night?" He polished another glass. "No." "Oh, it's usually weirder. A woman at the end of the bar overheard us. Last Tuesday, 2 people argued for 40 minutes over whether microphones make people lie, and they agreed microphones don't. They just make the lies louder." Even the bartender applauded that one. The atmosphere kept getting lighter. Something strange happens when people realize nobody's recording them. The performance disappears. Rehearsed smiles fade. The polished speeches dissolve. People begin sounding human, not perfect, not polished, just exhausted. And strangely funny, one man leaned toward the group. "You know what nobody tells you about Washington? What? Every meeting starts 5 minutes late. So every person still arrives 10 minutes early. Why?"
So they can complain the meeting hasn't started.
The room erupted. Someone pointed across the bar. That's the most bipartisan thing anyone said all year. The bartender rang a tiny brass bell. "Fresh basket of fries." Everyone looked. Nobody moved. Finally, he sighed. "I swear politicians campaign harder for appetizers than they do for votes." That got another laugh. I noticed something interesting. No one was talking about ideology anymore. They were talking about stress, schedules, airports, coffee, loosing sleep, accidentally answering emails at 3 in the morning. For one brief moment, everyone looked less like rivals and more like coworkers trapped inside the world's longest group project. Someone raised a glass. "Can I make a confession?" The bartender pointed dramatically. "Oh boy, I haven't had a full weekend off in months." Another voice answered immediately. "I forgot weekends existed." Someone else chimed in. "I scheduled a vacation. What happened?" "I canceled it so I could answer emails." The bartender blinked. "That's the saddest thing I've heard tonight." "Really?" "No." He looked around. "It's definitely top 10. The jukebox suddenly skipped. The music stopped. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then someone across the room started humming. Another joined in. Soon half the bar was humming completely different songs. It sounded like 5 radio stations trying to occupy the same frequency. The bartender shook his head. "I've officially stopped asking questions." A waiter carried out a mountain of nachos. Every conversation immediately stopped. Politics vanished. Debates disappeared. People who couldn't agree on anything somehow reached unanimous agreement. "Those look incredible." The bartender smiled. "See? What? Food accomplishes what legislation never can. What's that? Bipartisanship." Someone reached for the first chip. 5 other hands reached at exactly the same time. Everyone froze. The bartender watched patiently. "So, go ahead. No, you. No, really. No, after you." Finally, the bartender picked up the chip himself. Crisis solved. A man at the corner laughed so hard he nearly spilled his drink.
Honestly?
"What? This is the most productive meeting I've attended all month. What did we accomplish?" "We agreed the nachos are good. That's actually huge." I realized I hadn't looked at my phone in almost an hour. It never happens. Usually my phone buzzes every 30 seconds with another breaking story explaining why everyone should immediately become anxious. Instead, I was watching adults argue about mozzarella sticks. Somehow that felt healthier. The bartender noticed. You stopped doom scrolling. I did. Congratulations. For what? You've officially entered vacation mode. I'm still in Washington. Exactly. The room filled with laughter again. Not forced laughter, not audience laughter. Real laughter, the kind that catches people by surprise, the kind that makes someone forget, just for a second, who they were supposed to be. One customer stared thoughtfully into his drink. You know what's weird? What? We all spend every day trying to convince millions of people we know exactly what's happening. Yeah? I have absolutely no idea what's happening. Another voice immediately answered, finally, something everybody here believes. Even the bartender couldn't hide his smile anymore. I've been serving drinks in this city for 25 years. And I've learned something.
What?
The people who act the most confident usually order the menu without reading it. Someone laughed. What's wrong with confidence? Nothing. He placed another drink on the counter. Confidence and certainty aren't the same thing. For a brief second, the room actually became quiet, not awkward, thoughtful, and somebody ruined the moment. So, who wants dessert? The silence disappeared instantly. I do. No, I do. Get the brownie, the brownie, the brownie. You trust him? I trust chocolate. Fair. The bartender nodded toward me. You've been awfully quiet. I'm observing. Dangerous profession. I'm a comedian. Worse. Everyone laughed again. So what's your story? Someone asked me. I looked around the room. My job is basically explaining the news after it's already confused everybody. The bartender pointed. See? That's why comedians survive Washington. You're the only people who admit none of this makes complete sense. Outside, rain had started falling. Tiny drops slid down the windows, turning the lights of the city into long streaks of red, blue, and gold. Inside, the conversations kept rolling. Nobody wanted to leave. Not because tomorrow wouldn't arrive. It always did. Because this little basement bar offered something almost impossible to find in Washington, a place where nobody needed a prepared statement, nobody needed a camera-ready smile, nobody needed to pretend they had every answer. For one evening, they could simply be tired people sharing stories over drinks and terrible bar food. And honestly, that might have been the most unbelievable thing I'd witnessed all year. I glanced toward the bartender. He was already wiping down glasses again, completely calm, as though none of this was unusual. Maybe for him it wasn't. Maybe every night in Washington ended exactly like this, not with dramatic speeches. Breaking news, but with laughter echoing through an old basement bar, while tomorrow's headlines patiently waited outside in the rain. By the time the clock behind the bar crept past midnight, the room had changed in a way only a great neighborhood bar can manage. When everyone first walked in, they carried invisible luggage, stress, deadlines, headlines, argument meetings that should have been emails, voicemails that somehow became meetings. Now those burdens had been traded for half-empty glasses, shared stories, and the kind of laughter that sneaks up on you when nobody's trying to impress anyone. The bartender looked around proudly. Well, he said, nobody threw a chair tonight. A man at the end of the bar raised a finger. The night's still young. The bartender pointed at the clock. No, it isn't. Another wave of laughter rolled through the room. Someone finally turned up the music again, not because the room needed entertainment, because every conversation had reached that magical point where people naturally started talking over one another anyway. One group debated the greatest baseball comeback ever. Another argued about whether coffee counted as a personality trait. I don't have a caffeine addiction, one customer insisted. You've had 4 espressos. I was tired. It's midnight. Exactly. I leaned back and watched. For years, I joked on television that Washington was full of people who never admitted being wrong. Tonight, I discovered something different. Most people were perfectly willing to laugh at themselves as long as there wasn't a camera pointed at them. That felt oddly encouraging. The bartender wandered over. You've been writing mental notes all night. Occupational hazard. So what's the headline? I thought about it. People are weird. That's timeless. I was going to add even the important ones. He nodded. Now that's accurate. One of the regulars stood up dramatically. I'd like to make a toast. The room immediately responded, oh, no speeches. Keep it under 5 minutes. He placed a hand over his heart. I'll be brief. Nobody believed him. He cleared his throat to surviving another day. Everyone lifted a glass to surviving and to remembering. He paused for effect. That tomorrow's crisis will eventually become next week's punchline. It earned a genuine round of applause, not because it solved anything, because everyone understood exactly what he meant. Outside, the rain had stopped. The city streets reflected the lights of passing cars like ribbons of silver. Washington looked polished again, almost peaceful. You'd never guess that inside one anonymous basement bar, a room full of exhausted people had spent hours reminding one another they were still human. The bartender suddenly rang a small brass bell. Everyone looked over. Last call. A chorus of theatrical groans filled the room. No! 5 more minutes! I just got comfortable! He folded his arms. Been comfortable for 3 hours. We can improve. Not legally. People began finishing their drinks. Chairs scraped against the wooden floor. Coats appeared from nowhere. Phones that had been ignored all evening suddenly buzzed back to life. Reality was clocking back in. One customer glanced at the screen and sighed. There are 42 unread messages. Another looked.
I've got 60.
The third smiled proudly. I turned my phone off. The bartender pointed at him. Smartest decision made in this building tonight. As everyone slowly drifted toward the door, conversations became quieter. Promises replaced punchlines. We should do this again next month, assuming civilization survives. Fair. Someone laughed. We'll schedule it. Another replied, no calendars tonight. Everyone agreed. For one evening, they had escaped schedules. There was no reason to ruin the memory by creating another one. I waited until most of the room had emptied before settling my tab. The bartender slid the receipt across the counter. You stayed longer than most first-timers. I wasn't expecting the evening. Nobody ever is, so tell me. He looked up. Does this happen every night? He smiled. Not exactly. What changes? The names. I laughed. Everything else? He shrugged. The stories are different. The people think their week was the craziest. They swear nobody could possibly understand. They laugh. They eat too many fries. They promise to come back. Eventually, he tucked a clean glass onto the shelf. They remember they're just people. That sentence stayed with me. They're just people. It's an easy thing to forget. Television has a funny way of flattening everyone into headlines. Heroes, villains, experts, failures, winners, losers. Those labels fit neatly inside a news segment. Real people don't. Real people are complicated. They're exhausted. They're funny when they least expect it. They're capable of taking themselves far too seriously 1 minute and laughing at their own terrible jokes the next. I stepped outside. Cool night air hit immediately. Washington was quiet now. The monuments stood in the distance, lit against the dark sky, looking as permanent as ever. The headlines would return in a few hours. The interviews, the speeches, the arguments, the endless parade of opinions delivered with complete certainty. Tomorrow would look exactly like Washington always looked. But tonight, I'd seen another version, one hidden beneath the surface. A version where people put down the performance for a while, where nobody needed applause, where nobody was trying to win an argument. Strangers became conversation partners over shared baskets of fries and stories that grew funnier every time they were told. As I started walking home, I caught myself smiling. Not because the world suddenly made sense. Definitely didn't. If anything, it seemed even stranger than before. But maybe that was the point. Comedy has never been about pretending life is orderly. It's about admitting that life is gloriously chaotic and finding something to laugh about before the next breaking news alert arrives. That's the strange gift of humor. It doesn't erase disagreements. It doesn't solve impossible problems. It simply reminds us that for a few minutes, we're all looking at the same absurd situation and thinking, can you believe this? Sometimes that's enough. The next morning, he'd be back behind a desk under bright studio lights, delivering jokes about another unbelievable day in the news. The audience would laugh, the cameras would cut away, another show would end. But somewhere in the city, long after the broadcasts were over and the headlines had changed again, I like to imagine that little basement bar would open its doors. A few tired faces would wander in. The bartender would already know their orders. Someone would complain about their week. Someone else would insist theirs had been worse. A basket of fries would settle an argument that politics never could. And for a little while, beneath the noise of the Capitol, an ordinary conversation would quietly beat extraordinary chaos. Maybe that's the closest thing Washington has to peace. Maybe that's why every city needs a place where titles don't matter nearly as much as whether you're willing to laugh at yourself. Because in the end, the jokes aren't really about politics. They're about people. And people, thankfully, will probably never stop giving comedians material.